My thought today was just having a conversation.
Sure.
Like that's it. Like just a conversation. I thought there was a variety of different ways that we could go with this. Number one, we got a big political thing going on, right?
Yeah.
How that could affect behavioral health, addiction, the landscape of addiction. You know that better than anybody. I mean, you've been on different campaign trails, et cetera, from 2008. Well, prior to 2008, correct?
We'll see. My first volunteer stuff was in 12, but
It was in 12.
Yeah, but that point forward, it was kind of after grad school. Then from 16 and on, it's been basically what I've been doing in every cycle. So
Yeah. 16. Who did you not run with? Isn't the right word,
Yeah.
but campaign with?
Yeah, I can run you through a little background, I guess.
Yeah.
So yeah, my first paid gig was in 2016 for the DFL in CD8. So based out of Duluth originally, but that's the huge congressional district. We were trying to reelect Rick Nolan, who was the congressman at the time.
Which is the biggest geographical landscape in the state of Minnesota.
Actually, it's the second biggest geographical congressional district in the country.
Really?
Only one bigger than down in Texas. I don't remember the number, but that was a big
Like
talking
what
point
west
for us.
side? I'm sure El
Yeah.
Paso, something like that.
It was a gigantic one, but so a very geographically and economically diverse district. I mean, and we'll see what it looks like after redistricting happens next year. That's one of the reasons why this election is so important. But so I started in 2016 with the DFL as an organizer.
But you started in 12, though.
As a volunteer.
As a volunteer.
A volunteer
Okay.
in 12 in Duluth for President Obama's reelection campaign. That's what kind of sparked the interest.
Yeah.
Just,
What did you learn right out the gates from, let's just call it that, internship volunteering?
It was
Door to door?
Yeah, door to door, phone calling, volunteer management, all that stuff.
Wow.
Where it kind of came in a matter of months. And he went from just kind of making phone calls twice a week to being asked to, find more volunteers, become a neighborhood team leader, kind of create a network of volunteers that can then create their own network of volunteers. Sounds kind of pyramid scheming, but no money was involved.
Yeah.
So, but it was all for the goodwill and all for for a good cause and a good purpose. And it was an eye-opening experience. I was put in charge of organizing in House District 3B, which is just north of Duluth, kind of in the Saginaw, moving not quite to the range, but on the way up.
Dumb question. I'm sorry for my naivete here, but 12 re-election was running on Obamacare, correct?
Yeah, so it was.
One of the main.
Yeah, Obamacare got originally passed in 10.
Yes.
Or that was at least when they tried to get it through. And then it was really trying to run on this idea that we need to be protected and that needed to be expanded and needed to be, made sure that the law was set in stone. And that didn't happen until, I think, 2014 when the Supreme Court actually ruled on it and said that, it was the law of the land at that point.
But those are, I'm sure, a lot of the questions that were coming up.
Oh, yeah.
When you were calling people, talking, I'm sure making probably 100 calls a day.
Oh, more, yeah, a ton. And it was people were asking questions about, how does this affect my health care? What does this mean for my kids? What does this mean for my family? What does this mean for my private insurance? And a lot of it was kind of just, at that point at least, kind of easing fears. Because it was the biggest, transition in healthcare that we've had since. I can't think of another one, really.
And quite frankly, we're a decade into this, and the same questions, conversations are still coming up, like back to, education or lack thereof.
Yeah. That's a huge part of being an organizer is educating the populace. People just don't have time. It's
resources.
It's not a knock on people who are uninformed. I don't like to call the average vote. I think a lot of people try to say the average voter or the electorate's ignorant. And the reality is they're just busy. They have jobs, they have families, they have lives. There's only so much you can process in a day.
For sure.
And I don't blame people for saying, you know what, like I just got done with my 9 to 5. I just, fed the kids and put them to bed. Would I rather watch like hard-hitting news or would I rather put on a late-night talk show and just try to de-stress? That's just part of being a person. And so when you have an opportunity to have an honest conversation with someone, whether it's around healthcare, whether it's around any issue that's important to you or you're passionate about, you got to take advantage of that.
For
and
sure.
You have to come at it from an angle of education and not an angle of superiority or talking down to people. That just turns people off, and it's not appropriate. And you're not going to win any hearts and minds when you do that. And that's what we're really trying to do when you're an organizer, when you're becoming an activist. is it's less about necessarily an intellectual argument, and it's more about an emotional one.
Yeah,
And
no, I can see that, especially today.
Absolutely.
Look at how polarizing it is right now.
Yeah,
It's
I
crazy.
mean, even more polarized than we were 10 years ago, which was hard to believe. I mean, 10 years ago was the Tea Party revolution. That was really what sparked me into wanting to get involved, was when Jim Oberstar lost his election to Chip Kravac.
Yeah.
And I was at their debate at the deck, and that was a debate that ended in actual violence outside. People actually got into fistfights. People were arrested for assault. People were throwing things from the stands at a 19-term sitting U.S. congressman. Were throwing things. It was I'd never seen anything like it. And then he lost, and it was like, okay, well, what can I do? I was in college at the time. I was 20 years old. It was, what can I do going forward to, at the very least, say, well, if something bad happens, at least I did my part in trying to stop it. And if something good happens, I want to be a part of it. I want to try to affect change at a big scale. That was originally why I wanted to go into teaching, but I found that if you want to affect the most change, this is the kind of work you can do. It's not the only thing you can do, but it was something that kind of met my skill set, and it interested me.
You love doing it?
I love it, yeah.
Oh.
From 12 on.
12 to 16, to tell me a little bit about that, and then naturally the 16, you did what exactly?
Yeah, so after volunteering in 12, I went to grad school for a couple of years, got my master's in history. That was originally my goal, was to move on to get my doctorate. I decided not to do that for a variety of reasons that are not really relevant right now, but I learned so much about, mainly focusing on 20th century U.S. history, social movements, social injustice, and also one of my subfields was labor and family, and how work impacts family, and how, without a job, without steady work, and without, that kind of stability, what that means to a family and what that means to the next generations of a family.
Makes sense.
And that informs a lot of what I talk about when I talk to voters about, whether it's a candidate or an issue. I learned a lot from that I wanted to take into the educational field, but still became important to me in this line of work. So came back to Duluth after getting my master's in 2015, kind of floated around, was waiting for 2016 to get involved. Got hired by the DFL, started organizing in Duluth. After about 6 weeks, was asked to become a regional field director and move down to Cambridge and run the Cambridge and the Brainerd offices and manage 4 organizers full time.
For which campaign again?
For Rick Nolan.
For Rick Nolan.
For Rick Nolan and for any of the local candidates in the area. So
makes sense.
We had, every 2 years the Minnesota State House is up for re-election, so we had local House reps that were either running for re-election or Democrats that were trying to unseat Republicans. We had state senators who were trying to, do the same thing. So we were supporting all DFL candidates in those local areas, and I was working in Cambridge primarily, getting out to Brainerd once or twice a week, doing a lot of driving, as you'd expect. And obviously that election was not really great for where I stand politically and for where my hope is that we can continue to go. Yeah. Rick Nolan won his race. Yeah. It was the most competitive race in the country, and at the time the most expensive House race in the history of elections in the United States. Of course, that's just going to get broken every single cycle going forward with all the outside money that pours in and all the additional ways you can advertise, the increasing spending on social media, and all the different ways that people do it. But it was an eye-opening experience. It was incredibly arduous. It was difficult. We went through a lot of a lot of personnel turnover, but somehow we won. I think there's some reasons behind that. We ran against a historically weak opponent in Stuart Mills from Mills Fleet Farm.
Yep, Mills Fleet Farm.
With the long hair and all that good stuff. And but Rick was also the kind of a rare breed of a politician who could kind of balance being progressive, being folksy, being down to earth, being for labor, but also being incredibly socially progressive when it came to issues around marriage equality, legalization of marijuana, all these things that people on the far left, you would say, kind of honed in on at that time. He checked those boxes, and he also checked the more moderate boxes of being very much for labor and trying to make sure if we can do mining safely, we want to do it. If not,
I was just going to ask about St. Louis County. Is St. Louis County notoriously voted Democrat or Republican? So
it's a little misleading because Duluth primarily votes Democrat, and it's overwhelmingly Democrat. But
the range,
as soon as you move out of Duluth, it gets redder and redder and redder. The Iron Range used to be a Democratic stronghold, but Trump carried that area very strongly in 2016.
And I imagine it's only going to be stronger this election.
That's the fear in a lot of ways. If you're going to run, if you're going to run as a Democrat up in the range or even in western Minnesota in the Brainerd area, you kind of have to, like, I'll just be honest, like, you have to run as a pro-life Democrat, which is a very much a dying breed. There are not many of those people left. The linguistics behind pro-life versus pro-choice. That's a completely separate podcast.
What about unions?
Yeah.
You look at unions from the range. Whether it's the steel, the steel mill union. We have arguably one of the strongest unions probably in the country in regards to the nursing union. Then you add in the teachers union, right? So we're a strong state when it comes to unions. And I'm just kind of a little bit shocked in regards to, because the majority of time the unions usually lean left, don't they?
They do.
Okay.
But it really is the issue around this around mining, and in particular copper nickel mining.
Got it.
That is alienating people, and union workers feel alienated by Democratic candidates who simply say no, and it's become this issue between clean water and mining, and not this idea where we can try to find a way to do both. If we have the best technology, if we have the best resources, and if we have the best union protections, it stands to reason that we should at least try. At least that's my personal take on it. But if you say no to mining, that's where you lose the Iron Range. And you have groups like Conservation Minnesota, you have groups like Duluth for Clean Water, who sometimes try to walk the line, but in some cases just go way over and say, no, absolutely not. We're not doing this. And there's good reasons for it. They talk about seeing the effects of copper nickel mining in other regions, where in certain companies like Polymet that are trying to open these mines, they have a bad track record in South America where it's damaging the water supply permanently. And that's a huge issue. It should be.
Naturally.
Everyone wants clean water. Everyone needs access to clean water. At the same time, we are trying to transition to a clean energy economy, away from coal, away from fossil fuels, and into things like copper. And we have a huge copper reserve up in the Iron Range that has not been tapped yet. And I would make the argument that if we don't try to find a way to make it happen safely, we have to continue to lean on how we're getting copper right now. And unfortunately, a lot of the ways we get copper right now is through child labor in third world countries.
Very
true. That's a huge problem. So, but that again speaks to the polarization. People are being further pulled apart. In 2016, that was the issue that just sucked the air out of the room.
Yeah, and you do have to be empathetic to the other side, though, right?
Absolutely.
Which is, go drive up in Chisholm, Virginia, Evelyn, Gilbert, you name it, right? And if those cities basically influx up and down over the last 100 years. I mean, I number one, you'd probably argue that World War II was basically saved by the range, right? And so there's a long history there in our country of what the range has done, not only for Minnesota but the United States as a whole. Very proud individuals that hard work, right? Blue collar work. It is difficult shit what they do each and every day, or their ancestors have went through in order to bring them there. I bet you there's fear.
Oh, 100%.
I bet you there's fear that could revert back. Or revert back to moving a whole fucking town from Hibbing to the other side of Hibbing, right? Just basically to move from one mine to the next or whatever that looks like in order to, mine more for the future. In the future, quite frankly, of their livelihood.
Yeah, I mean, the reality is that if that's the kind of job, and I think a lot of industries are this way, where your job becomes part of your identity, becomes who you are. And who am I to tell you that you need to change that? That's a huge issue. It's simply not just saying, when you hear someone as disingenuous as Ivanka Trump say to these people who have been laid off through COVID to say, find something new.
Yeah.
We specifically don't do that with people up in the range because we know how much that hurts. You are taking a piece of their identity, of their parents' identities, of their grandparents' identities, generations of work in these regions. These people very much care about their hometown. They want it to thrive. They want people around them to succeed.
Correct.
What they don't want to see is their hometown turn into a ghost town. None of us want that.
No.
At the same time, we have to try to find a balance. We have to look at things like solar energy, wind energy. You could create great new jobs by investing, having companies that are, creating solar farms and wind farms and putting those people to work in those ways. It's a similar kind of work, but it's not the same, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it's still in the same idea of, creating energy for people to use. The challenge is finding a way to sell it. The challenge is trying to find a way to not patronize people. Mm-hmm. And too often, I think people of my own party end up kind of doing that. We patronize. We say, well, if you really cared, you would do this or that. And no one likes to be talked to like that, especially when you're talking about something that's so near and dear to your heart, and it's ingrained in you.
For sure.
People grow up on the Iron Range, and they're going to do this work. They've known it forever. Their dad did it, their grandpa did it, their mom did it, whatever it was. Their aunts and uncles did it. And people feel the same way about nursing. People feel the same way about education. There's a reason that people, get into the same fields as their parents or their aunts and uncles, because they're inspired by them. Absolutely. And we certainly don't want to turn people off from that. Mm-hmm. We also have to look at the realities of the modern world and understand the impact we're having on the only planet that we know we can live on. Exactly. It's a huge issue. And
currently, Musk wants to change that, but we shall see.
2016 was a hotbed in a lot of ways. And that issue sucked the air out of the room of every single discussion that we had with people.
In 16.
In 16. It didn't matter, if you would find people, who typically would vote for a Democrat, and they would say, I'm with you on things like gun violence. I'm with you on things like taxing, the wealthy. Mm-hmm. I'm with you on things like healthcare, But are you anti-mining?
No doubt. So let's also take this conversation about the taxing of the wealth, right?
Yeah.
Could you just articulate, maybe for somebody like myself who's less educated on exactly what that looks like, right? So to take me through, the tax bracket taxing, for lack of better words, of what that looks like, right? I know that we talk about this magic number, about $250,000 a lot in regards to your family making X, Y, Z. But let's call a spade a spade. The median household income in the United States is what, $53,000?
Yeah, it's something like that.
So just take me through, what the tax landscape looks like, so people know exactly what that is.
Yes, we have a progressive tax system in the United States. So the more you make, at least the way it's supposed to work, the more you make, the more you are taxed. I think what people tend to forget is, and it just takes a little bit of explanation. When you hear something like, just as a hypothetical, like you hear like 35% tax on people who make $250,000 or more. Mm-hmm. People seem to think that if you make $1 less than that, you're in this 30% bracket. But once you make that extra dollar and go to $250, you get bumped up, and then they just suck money away from you. That's not how it works. It's a progressive tax system in the way that you get taxed 35% on your $250,000th and up. So the first $10,000 that anyone makes in the year is not taxed. And if you make, I think, in the last couple of years it's changed. The Trump tax cuts have changed these things. They've reverted the tax increases on the wealthy that President Obama put into place, dropped it from 38% to 35%. But you think back to the Eisenhower administration in the 50s, the top 1%. The tax bracket was up at 90%.
90%?
90%. And again, it's not saying if you make $1 million, you lose $900,000. It's once you get to a certain threshold, then you start getting taxed at that rate. So
makes sense. But
that allowed us to fund social programs. That allowed us to fund all the programs that were put in with the New Deal and keep them going. And that allowed, the United States to run at a budget surplus rather than a budget deficit. Once you start cutting those things down, it's one thing to, and people who are going to defend the tax code and say that it doesn't need to be changed will often tell you that you're vilifying wealth. You'll look at people, the common attack on someone like Bernie Sanders is they want to redistribute wealth to people who didn't earn it. Mm-hmm. But one thing we've learned through COVID is that, you can see the stats online. The billionaires like Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk and Bill Gates have made an astonishing amount of money in the last 6 months, as millions of Americans have lost their jobs. Mm-hmm. And Congress is bickering over, these stimulus checks, $1,200, or the enhanced unemployment, dropping it from an additional $600 a week, and then it expired. And now Trump has done some kind of executive order for $400 a week, but that hasn't really kicked in yet. And people are suffering while 10 billionaires have made something like $100 billion extra money and more in the last 6 months. So when we talk about the taxes, it is something that links directly into healthcare. because I think a lot of people, we talk about, this idea of Medicare for all, which would mean you don't have to worry about private insurance. We're the only, very rich nation, if you will, that still has the majority of our healthcare tied to our employment. If you lose your job, you lose your health insurance. Thankfully, we live in a state here where we have safety nets built in, like Minnesota Care and medical assistance.
Prepaid medical assistant plans as well.
Yeah, and all that stuff is incredibly important. But so many other nations, your healthcare is quote unquote government run, and it works. And you pay more taxes on your paycheck, but in the end, you don't pay premiums, you don't pay copays, you don't pay for you don't pay insane amounts for prescriptions, and you don't see price gouging on life-saving medicines like insulin, which is just incredibly criminal. The fact that diabetic people rely on this and need it to live, and the price of insulin has gone up something like 800%.
Yeah, I saw that. The last article I read was almost 1,000% that it's increased.
So when you think about this idea of Medicare for all, and we think about how, and the common retort is, how are you going to pay for it? The answer is taxing the rich their fair share. And you can also look at other ways of, and this is going to get into other discussions about what we could, quote unquote, defund, but to take a small percentage of things we've been overfunding and funnel it towards healthcare, it can work.
Give an example of, 2 or 3 things that you'd suggest from defunding XYZ back into our healthcare system.
Yeah, the biggest thing you can do, and this is not my argument or my idea necessarily, is something I've seen, and a lot of politicians have talked about it, people from Bernie Sanders to Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Rashida Tlaib and even Ilhan Omar have talked about what you could do if you cut the military budget by 10%. We would still have the most highly funded military in the world because we outspend the next 10 to 15 countries combined on our military. But even that itself would be enough to pay for Medicare for all, and would also allow us to massively invest in things like college, not necessarily maybe free college for all, but saying if your family makes under a certain amount of money, say $100,000 a year, you can go to any public school for free for 4 years.
Yeah. So, and I know this term usually gets, broadcasted negatively, but it's almost subsidizing, for all intents and purposes, education in college.
Yeah. I mean, if we're going to continue to hold that as the standard bearer and have a college diploma be what can be the big gate that keeps you away from a career where you can not only make a good wage, but actually be able to invest and grow generational wealth. We are not allowing people to do that by simply saying, since you can't afford to go here, you can't afford to get the education that you need. And I'm not saying everyone needs to or should go to a 4-year school. That would also include things like 2-year trade schools. That's a huge push.
Huge.
And that was a huge push during the Obama administration in the last 4 years, was making community college and trade school not only less expensive but free for most people, understanding that it's a small investment to make in what people with these high-paying jobs with great benefits are going to put back into the economy over time. It is an investment that will grow and will triple and quadruple.
Did you go to UMD?
So I went to St. Scholastica.
So you went to St. Scholastica
for 4 years, yeah.
So check this out. My first year at UMD, my tuition, and room and board. Guess what that was in 2000?
In 2000?
2000.
For 1 year?
1 year.
$10,000.
$8,900.
Yeah.
Full cost of everything, right? I take that back. Outside of books.
Yeah.
Okay. Today, I think I read it like $26,000. Is that right?
It's something nuts.
For University of Minnesota?
Yeah, and for in-state students, you get a discount. You can always get scholarships, but the rising cost of education is unbelievable, especially when you consider how it's not being tied to inflation.
Yeah.
A good example.
Not at all.
No, a good example of that would be a couple things. So when my mom was growing up, she went to the University of Michigan, grew up there, so in-state tuition for a year was $350.
$350.
And she worked she was a security guard at Buick, and she made, I think, what was she making? Something close to like $22 an hour back then. Which is, that's kind of
doing it.
That's doing it. I mean, even now,
today,
if you're making $22 an hour now, you're making something like $45,000 a year.
It's good money.
That's usually enough to not only get by, but to have a little bit of money to put aside and to invest
support
in
your
kids.
family, whatever that looks like.
Whatever that looks like for you. And
especially in a dual earning household.
Exactly.
Right. If that's one income, okay. But if you have a dual earning income, I mean, that's setting yourself up for success, I would say.
Yep. I would agree with that. And But the reality is the prices of college have gone through the roof, wages have not gone up, and people at the top continue to get wealthier and wealthier. We have the most. I mean, the wealth gap in the United States is the biggest it's ever been. It's continued to grow in the last few years. It dipped very slightly, not as much as we wanted during the 8 years of President Obama, but it's skyrocketed again with these tax cuts that affect corporations more than people. And you have to talk too about the tax code and the fact that the system is set up for the 1% to abuse it, because they not only are they able generationally to get the best education to understand how to do it, but they can also afford to pay for the best lawyers that know how to do it for them.
CPAs, accountants.
Exactly. And if you have access to that, you can't just be, Joe Schmo down living in the suburbs making, 75 grand a year, good money, but you're not talking about access to people who know how to use the system and tweak it and twist it to their advantage. And this has been happening for, decades and decades and decades, and at least a century now, where old money continues to kind of rule the world.
Yeah. Old money also turns into incredibly valuable new money.
Yeah, that's true. And,
right?
and the fact that you can have X dollars. The idea that if you have $50 billion and you need, I don't even know what you would do with that money. You can't spend it. It's impossible to spend that. And you have like Jeff Bezos worth over $100 billion now. It's just an unfathomable amount of money. I don't think people realize like how much more money $1 billion is as opposed to $1 million.
No kidding.
That's 1,000 millions.
I know.
And he's got 100 of them.
Yeah, and you had brought up earlier about over the last 5-6 months with the pandemic and what does that look like with the wealth of the top 10 on Forbes, and what is that doing for their own personal value and wealth. And the counter argument would of course be those are the individuals that have actually like allowed our economy to be sustained today, right? That whether it's through ordering on Amazon, whether it's the vehicles that we are getting to back to from A and B, whether it's some of the pharmaceutical makeups of the medications that we have in order to continue to progress our country and or your own personal health. So it's just basically coming down to the question always is how much is too much?
I think that's one of the questions too. But for me, the biggest question comes down to, or maybe the biggest conundrum, is the role the government can play. Because most people don't want the government to control everything that they do. I understand that, and neither do I. As someone who believes in, for lack of a better term, big government and the impact that it can have on the people who are less fortunate, this idea that at some point, you would expect these people at the top to understand where they're at with their wealth and what it looks like for others. But all you see is greed. The argument is that the free market will regulate itself and that these people will understand, if I give back X dollars to these people, it will only help me in the long run. But they don't do it. So at some point, there needs to be an entity that holds these people accountable to understand not only are you making an exorbitant amount of money on the backs of people that you're paying $15 an hour. Yeah, $15 an hour is better than, the federal minimum wage is still $7.25.
Still $7.25.
That's insane.
No, what about like the Gates Foundation? In your heart of hearts, do you believe the Gates Foundation is making change and set up, for wealth redistribution of, Mr. Gates and, what he's developing, establishing to help, with the world issues, world problems? Do you find value in what he's done with his wealth?
I do.
You do?
I think he might be the best example of the quote-unquote compassionate billionaire, although his net worth is still insane, but he's taken the pledge to give all that money away when he dies. And you can look at the statistics and the things that they've done in Africa. Literally millions of lives saved.
Yep.
This idea of how do you create access to clean water, how do you create vaccines for and drugs to combat diseases like malaria that at one point were ravaging that entire continent, and now it's still a problem, but it's actually improving. You'd like to see that from the others, but you really don't. And I'm not going to sit here and heroificate Bill Gates and say he's a godsend, but the things that he's done are undeniable.
And I would agree. But also, like that's low hanging fruit.
It is.
Right? Low hanging fruit is, in my humble opinion, clean water. Being able to use the restroom and not have your feces be transitioned into what the water you drink,
Mm-hmm.
right? So there's that argument. How about in our backyard?
Yeah.
Right? How about in our backyard? Like, the United States of America. And I'm all about changing anybody's life for the better, right? Whether on any one of the continents that there are in our globe. But in our backyard, what have we done to substantially change the poverty level? Because the poverty is real here too, right?
Oh, yeah.
What have we done to do that in our backyard?
Yeah,
What
imagine
how have we made major waves and movements? And that's, I think, the argument that a lot of people have. Like, we aren't seeing it here though.
Yeah. Imagine if Elon Musk decided to use union labor to make all of the Tesla cars instead of robots.
Yeah.
Imagine if he opened up factories all over the United States and hired union laborers with good benefits, with high pay. I mean, that was the argument back in the 30s with Henry Ford. Was he raised wages because he knew that if his workers were happier, they'd make better products and they would want to come to work.
Yeah.
Very problematic man aside, that's a good idea. Same with Elon Musk. If he actually, put his money where his mouth was and said, all right, I'm going to do this. I'm going to make less money. I already have more money than I'll ever need. Generations of my family will have all the money they'll ever need forever. So what is the point of making more?
Yeah.
Why not invest? And you could imagine if someone did that, you would become a hero. You become a hero to actually millions of people and to generations of people, but you don't see it. I think a lot of we need to focus on wealth inequality in this country, and at the most basic levels, it is simply things like access to healthcare, access to housing. We can end homelessness in this country at the drop of a hat if we want to. We have the money to do it. Other countries in Europe have experimented with it and taken homeless people off the streets and given them apartments and given them jobs.
Yeah.
And the rate of people who fall back into that lifestyle or fall back into that into the massive poverty is low. It works.
Purpose.
Yeah, if
right?
you give
purpose.
people purpose, that's part of, I think, again, the human condition.
Yeah.
When you find something to be passionate about, or when you find purpose, and when you see results, you want to keep seeing them.
Yeah.
That's just how we operate. And there will always be the small select few who don't do it. But but we are judging an entire group of people based on, a small fraction of them.
For sure.
And then you're lumping everybody in. I think about what's happened in Kenosha in the last couple of days. Yeah. And it's very frustrating to me to see this 17-year-old kid who killed these protesters, and immediately people come to his defense saying he's a kid. He isn't, he doesn't represent all of these people in these, quote unquote, like militias and these neighborhood groups. But at the same time, for some reason, George Floyd represented all black people in Minneapolis, and that's not fair. It's not right. It's not acceptable to lump everyone in to say that you are the representative for a movement like Black Lives Matter, when that's not even how that movement works. So we have a lot of work to do, but at the most basic level, access to a home, access to shelter, access to healthcare, access to a job,
hierarchy needs.
These are what everyone deserves and should have. And we have the money to do it. It's just about priorities, and what we prioritize in this country is not that. We prioritize individualism in particular. We don't prioritize the collective. And once you start talking about that, the scare tactics come in, talking about, oh, this is socialism, oh, this is communism, this is this and that. It doesn't have to be those things. Capitalism can coexist with a progressive tax system that actually gives everyone a safety net, so you don't have to worry that if you or your loved one gets sick, you're going to get wiped out by medical debt. No one should be going broke because they get sick. You can't control that. You can be the healthiest person in the world and you can still get lung cancer. You can be the healthiest person in the world and you can have an aneurysm or a stroke.
For sure.
And then you get sent home with a $100,000 medical bill that you can never pay off.
Yep.
And then not only does that ruin your wealth or your investments or where you're at, but then that doesn't go away when you die. That gets sat on your kids and your family, and you are setting people back for generations. And in particular, these kind of things have impacted people of color since forever in the United States. And you can look at the numbers that show that policies like redlining, policies that date back to Jim Crow, have denied, in particular, black families the ability to do things like buy houses. That's the best way to create wealth for yourself, is to own a home. And we have, a legacy of these kind of racist policies that have continually kept people of color and black families in particular in certain places, and then that quote unquote becomes the inner city, and then people want to stay away from it, and property values are nothing there. That's not by accident. This was all done on purpose. And if you spend even a week with specific books that talk about it from historians that have studied it, you'll be like, oh, okay, this didn't just happen. It doesn't work like that. These are purposeful things that were done by people who are trying to protect what the status quo is.
It's absolutely
and that's
right.
what threatens people.
4 years ago, there obviously a historic election, female running for president, etc. What was your reaction the next day, or did you stay up through the night? And...
So I was working. So I was the way that it worked was by the end of that election, I had been asked to do all of take over as the lead reporter for CD8 for the DFL. So all of the election results were coming into the Duluth office, and I was responsible for entering everything into this giant spreadsheet that everyone had access to at the higher levels, so we could track what was going on.
Were you like, holy shit, this is changing a different way than...
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, from a national perspective, when they called Florida for Trump, 30 minutes after the polls closed, my heart stopped. Because the way that it looked on election morning, there's this website called the Princeton Election Consortium. Okay. And they, go with polling and modeling, and they give at the end, they give you a percentage. Like, this candidate has X percent chance to win this election. And on election day morning, they were saying it was 99% that Hillary Clinton was going to win. It didn't happen. And they had never been wrong before. And this was their most bold prediction ever. In 2012, I think they were at 92% for Obama, and it ended up being a runaway. When they called Florida early, and even prior to that, when the Wisconsin Senate race got called for, the Republican whose name is escaping me at this point, almost immediately, and all the polling had him down 10 points. It was a big uh-oh. It was a huge red flag. It was like, okay, something's very, very wrong here. And then, I start getting the messages from people, who are not in politics, who are like, what the hell's going on? You told me this couldn't happen. And I'm like, well, don't panic yet. He still has to get Pennsylvania and Ohio and Wisconsin and Michigan. And if we just get one of those, it doesn't matter. And he got them all. It was, there was an issue with the polling. There were polling errors in 2016 that large polling firms have addressed, and you can actually look at 2018, which was the most poll accurate election in American history. 2016 was not that. But I was up till about 3:30 in the morning that night. We were working at our office at the Duluth Labor Temple on London Road, which is attached to the Reef Bar. I'll be the first to say by about 11:30 we were at the Reef. We were working there.
I can imagine.
We're this is just terrible. And I mean, when we realized by 11 o'clock that this was happening, that Trump was going to win, I mean, I had staffers having full breakdowns.
I can imagine.
Full tears, trying to keep people together, because we still had work to do. We weren't able to call Nolan's race until about 2:45 in the morning.
Really?
And we had to stay there and continue to enter vote totals into our Nolan-specific spreadsheet to check trends against the past elections to see where we were. We had specific benchmarks in different districts or counties to say, if our vote share is here, that's good, or if it's here, that's bad. We're underperforming or overperforming certain areas. And by the end of it, we were able to, he won by just over 2,000 votes. Jeez. It was incredibly close. It was almost enough to...
For total, what are total votes?
It was like 0.6 points. Wow. It was almost a half a point. Okay. And if you get under that half a point threshold, there's an automatic state mandated recount. We were just outside of it. Stuart Mills did initially order a recount. It was within the threshold where he could do it if he wanted to pay for it. And then the day before the deadline, he backed out and said, never mind, I'm not going to do it. Yep. Didn't want to sink money into it. They did a little bit of digging and said, okay, this is legitimate, he lost. Yep. So we were up very late that night. We somehow won that race, and the next morning, it didn't really sink in for me. I had to stay in work mode. I had to stay as a manager. I had to stay as someone who was trying to keep everyone focused and on the ball, because we were hired specifically to focus on the Nolan race. The Hillary Clinton campaign had their own team that we shared an office with. You know, that was their job. Our job primarily was Nolan, because we knew, and the DFL and the Democratic Party as a whole knew that this was going to be a race that was going to be close and that the Republicans were targeting huge, and they spent so much money on it. So we won. We got to be happy for like 15 minutes. I went home. I went to bed. The next morning I drove back down to Minneapolis where I was living. And then I got to my apartment and I sat down, like super tired. I slept for like 3 hours, sat down, and then I was like, oh yeah, like this is terrible. Like this actually happened. It hit you. Oh yeah, like a ton of bricks. It actually happened, like this impossible thing. Because there were so many people for months and months and months then when Trump announced his candidacy that said, God, I hope he wins the nomination. This will be a cakewalk. Yeah. And I believed it. I was one of them, like, yeah, I mean, how can you lose? How can you lose to this guy? And we can talk all we want about, election fraud and Russian interference and all these things that, bipartisan Senate committee with Marco Rubio on it said, yeah, they colluded with Russia. They just last week they came out with that report. It's a Republican-led bipartisan committee. It's an undeniable fact. But, Clinton got 3 million more votes than Trump did, but that's not how the system works. No, it's not. And that's, again, a whole other discussion about whether we need an electoral college or not. I would argue we don't, because it was a system that was put in place.
Just popular votes.
Oh, yeah. I mean, if we really think that every vote's equal and every vote counts the same, why not the popular vote? Yeah. But that's a whole other thing. So, I mean, it hit you like a ton of bricks. I broke down for a little bit. I mean, I had been reassuring people close to me, in particular the women closest to me in my life, my now fiance, my sister, who's queer, people who were really afraid of this happening. And I said, I understand your fear. It's normal to be afraid, but we're not going to lose. And here's all the rational reasons why he has to do A, and then B, and then C, and then D, and then E, and then F. And if any one of those fails, we win. Mm-hmm. And somehow he did it. All those things that lined up and happened. And I was like, wow, I felt like I had lied to them. I felt like I had betrayed them personally. And I know that's not true, but, the emotions set in because you think, okay, well, we have to do this for 4 years at least. And now we're actually here. We're 60... It's Wednesday?
Yeah,
it's Thursday.
Thursday.
We're 67 days away, or 68 days away from Election Day today. Mm-hmm. We are just under 10 weeks out. So this could all be over in 67 days, or we could be facing down another 4 years. I'd argue that if Trump wins re-election, I don't see how we can ever win an election again. Yeah. And the consequences are so drastic and so dire when you consider, even if for somehow in 2024 a young Democrat, would win an election against, ideally not Trump, because he continues to talk about running for a third term, even though it's constitutionally illegal. But unfortunately, there are ways to change the Constitution that don't involve the Senate and the House. No. You can get a supermajority of governors in this country to change the Constitution. That's actually a thing. And it's not
fucking crazy.
It's not unrealistic. I mean, the first thing I said in 2017 when people were asking me, like, where do we go from here? Yeah. I said, well, the biggest problem is that he's going to dispute the election results no matter what they are.
No matter what.
He's going to lock himself in the Oval and refuse to come out. Yeah. And I still think that's a very strong possibility. He's already said, we'll see what happens. Mm-hmm. He's the first sitting president to not just answer the question, will you accept the results? Yes.
Yes.
The American people speak. That's the point of the election, right? Mm-hmm. He's the first one to openly say no and defy that. Yeah. I've been afraid that they would try to come after term limits in his second term and try to say it's for the good of the country we need that stability, blah blah blah. I mean that's when you turn this into some kind of really gross family dynasty and it becomes a dictatorship. That's not out of the realm of possibility. And that's really scary.
But just look at as far as the conventions as a whole, right? You look at the DNC convention and what that's looked like and who spoke and who talked, right? And then you look at the RNC. I mean, it's legitimately his entire family.
Yeah.
That's speaking, or it's political suicide for anybody else walking in there to talk at it because, let's face the facts here. When this is done, it's done.
Yeah.
Pence is done.
Yeah.
These other individuals that have been involved are done too. But I need to go back just a little bit here.
Sure.
When Obama was running, I was just thinking about like the hope in our country, right? And I get it. There's that big picture with Obama's face and hope and everything, but you could feel it. You could feel the movement. You could feel the change. You know, an African American male stepping up to that office in our land, and it was such just this amazing moment. I believe for our country.
Absolutely.
And seeing the African American population, and what their I mean, people in tears. I mean, for some individuals, I've heard it, whether it's on podcasts before on different videos, it was like their Super Bowl. You know, watching this moment in time. You know, from different generations of individuals through slavery, et cetera, seeing what they see today, and I think there were so many individuals of different color that were inspired by this moment, right?
Absolutely.
And then there was the next wave, and I'll be the first one to say I didn't like Hillary. I didn't like her. Like, I didn't like her. I thought she was unlikable. I didn't believe that she was honest. I felt like she was dishonest. I can go on and on about that particular situation about Hillary. But what was I inspired by is a female leader. You know, to have a female leader. Not necessarily that leader, but a female leader to run our country and see that. And I think, as an individual that has a daughter, I could see like, she could see that, the highest office in the land I could be a part of. Yep. Or those other individuals that, just see themselves in their professional development and careers, both personally and professionally, reach the highest office. And I thought that was super special in that opportunity. And where I'm at today is not inspired, not hope, but literally praying that something changes. Yeah. Right? That something changes. And why? Because the sheer dishonesty, disingenuine, lack of a moral compass, ethics. You can go on and on and on with every word, whether it's in business, whether it's in being a husband, whether it's being a wife, a significant other, whether it is how you treat other individuals. All the above, I think, and I've got to be careful with my language, just dog shit. Oh, yeah. As a human being and as a person. And what I don't know, and maybe you can help me out with, is how somebody can possibly jump on that bandwagon. Yeah. I don't get it. Yeah. I don't get it. Whether you are pro-life, whether you are a staunch Republican, whether you whatever, like, you're voting for that shit. Like, that's standing right there, that's standing before you. I mean, think of if Obama 6 years ago would say, China, we're coming for you. We're going to take you to war. Mm-hmm. Like, think about that. Think about what would happen.
Armed revolt in our country.
Correct, yeah. Right? Now, we have an individual that says shit like that.
All the time.
Legitimately. And it's in one ear, out the other. Why? It's because, I mean, he is basically the definition, I hate this terminology, but fake news. I mean, the language, the promises that come out of his mind, just gone. Mm-hmm. In one ear, out the other. So my question to you, again, ending here is, sorry on that rant, but my question ended to you is, how does this change in 60 some days? Yeah. Like what is the group running on that we can ensure that whether it's popular vote or the electoral college changes the wave?
Yeah, I think you hit on a lot of points there. I think the enthusiasm around Hillary Clinton was not high. And there were a lot of mistakes made in that campaign. I mean, you shouldn't run a campaign that is a rebuke of your opponent when that opponent is not the incumbent. Mm-hmm. So, unfortunately, the biggest, I think, mistake for the Hillary campaign was that the main message was, she's not Donald Trump. Mm-hmm. That's it. Yeah. And that works a little better now because he's the president. Mm-hmm. And we've been watching what he's done for 4 years. So that Correct. Still is part of the Biden-Harris campaign. But my hope is that it won't become the focal point like it ended up becoming during the debates in 2016 and during the final 60-plus days. Mm-hmm. It became about, Hillary's not Trump. That's not a good enough reason for me to vote for her. And then you have people vote third party. I mean, you can look at the breakdowns of Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania in particular. Mm-hmm. And if you take all of the votes for Jill Stein and for Gary Johnson, Libertarian, and give them to Hillary, she wins all the states. Gotcha. That's the difference in this presidency, mm-hmm. right there in one way. So you will see a lot of that this time, that Biden is not Trump. But I think what you're hitting on here, and the biggest thing, is the lack of morality that we're seeing and the lack of ethics. Republicans in 2016 harped on Benghazi which was
The emails.
The emails in Benghazi. 4 people died in Benghazi. I'm not trying to say that was like an acceptable loss. It's bad. It's unfortunate that it happened.
Correct.
People die in war, and these are things that happen. It's not good. We have 180,000 people who have died of COVID. 180,000 people. And what was he saying in March? That in April it'll disappear like a miracle.
Yep.
That you don't need to social distance. That all this mask stuff is just scare tactics. And we're still hearing that stuff. You hear the people at the RNC talk about COVID-19 like it's in the past, and 1,000 people are dying a day. It's not in the past.
Yeah.
And you can see what states where it's hitting the hardest are the states that opened up prematurely, like Florida and Texas and others. So, I struggle with this too, because I find myself on many issues to the left of Biden. I personally, voted for Elizabeth Warren in the primary. She was my preferred candidate. I'm a huge fan of hers. We have a big there's a big difference in the Democratic Party as opposed to the Republican Party, and it kind of works in 2 ways. The big difference is, one, Republicans seem to fall in line a lot more easily than Democrats do, or left-leaning voters. All these people who ran against Trump in the 2016 primary, people who, like Marco Rubio, Jeb Bush, Nikki Haley, who wasn't running but was supporting Rubio, they all said things, and Lindsey Graham, they all said things like he's a criminal, he's
pathological
liar,
liar.
He's not what we want our party to be, and now they all speak at the RNC and praise him.
Yeah.
They do that. We don't do that on this side. We have infighting. We bicker a lot more. And a lot of that is because we are a much larger tent party, especially here in Minnesota with the DFL. It's an alliance between Democrats, farmers, and laborers. Back in the 20s and 30s, there was the Farmer Labor Party and the Democratic Party, and then they merged. And that is kind of an uneasy alliance because you have a lot of different competing philosophies under one tent. And you are never going to find a candidate on the left that's going to check all the boxes for everyone in that tent. It's not going to happen.
And do you feel on the other side it does check all the boxes for the tent? So like
on the right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's a smaller tent, so there's less boxes to check.
Yeah.
And you have a lot more single issue voters on the right, where if you are not a pro-life candidate, it's not going to happen. It doesn't matter about anything else. If you are, not for getting rid of Roe v. Wade, I'm not going to vote for you, and I don't care what else happens. Even though we know the vast majority of people in the Republican Party would benefit from Democratic policies and have benefited from them in the past. So when you're dealing with a large tent party, you are going to always deal with dissension. You are always going to deal with people who are frustrated and upset. You have moderate Democrats who are afraid of politicians like Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, who push, these programs like Medicare for All and free college for things. And then you have people who support them who look at moderate candidates like Biden and say, what are you really? Yeah. Are you really a Democrat or not? For me, and this election comes down to, and I'm really happy to see the Biden campaign leaning into the fact that Joe Biden is a very empathetic and morally centered man. He was a great vice president. He was a great ear for President Obama to lean on and to listen to. And he, in a lot of ways, made that ticket work because he was a lot of the things that President Obama wasn't. He was experienced. He had
kind
the
of was his big brother, too.
Yeah, in a lot of ways. But he is still this kind of humble guy. He rode the Amtrak, and he commuted on the Amtrak. He's from Scranton, Pennsylvania. He's from a union family. He's also suffered loss. And you're going to see tonight when Trump speaks that the Biden campaign has bought a massive ad. It's like a 2-minute ad. It's going to run on all the networks. I've already watched it. It's online. It is tremendous. And it talks specifically about the fact that, he has gone through loss. He understands what that is. He's driven by purpose. He is not this kind of person that is looking to increase his wealth through this office. He's trying to do things for the right reasons. That's going to speak to a lot of people who on the center didn't like Hillary for the same reasons that they voted for Trump because he was an outsider, and now they're turned off by the fact that he has no idea what he's doing.
Yeah, I listened to it last night, and I heard it from I think 3 or 4 different individuals that spoke, and they were talking about how he doesn't need this job.
No.
Yeah, he he certainly doesn't need it. But I'll tell you what, he accepted it. He's in the position. And now I think that's their battle cry for he's doing a shitty job.
Yeah.
Right? He's doing a shitty job, so therefore it's like, I don't need this. I don't need it. I can walk away whenever I want. Well, it is what it is, bud.
Yeah, he's not walking away.
You-
People thought he
you-
wouldn't,
yeah.
run for a second term, and he would get fed up with it and say,
I'm
after
done.
3 years, I made America great again. I did it. I'm done.
Yeah,
Like, you guys can deal with this mess.
No, and how great is it? Make America great again, and now we're in Keep America Great.
Yeah.
4 years, baby.
It happened. We were great again. And for some reason, and that is making America great again is returning to the social policies of the 1950s and race riots.
Sad.
And and seeing peaceful protesters hosed down and having dogs sicked on them. Like, we've seen these images from when you're in high school history class. You see these images. That's what they want to return to. I mean, I have a hard time believing we were great at that point. There are things about America that are great, but as a whole, we have a lot of work to do. So
what happens? What happens 60 some days? What's your gut?
Well,
What does your gut tell you?
it's difficult because, I've actually been very comfortable with the idea of a Biden-Harris ticket for a long time. When I was talking to other politicos, of mine, and we talked about this stuff a few years back, I said to them, Biden-Harris is, in 2017, I was like, Biden-Harris is the ticket. Like, this is a ticket that can win. And in a fair election, I would have no problem saying, oh, we're going to win. But this election is not going to be fair. You look at what's happening with the USPS and Postmaster DeJoy trying to, screw with mail voting. That's how I voted since 2014. I voted by mail.
Huh.
And we are fortunate in Minnesota to have the best Secretary of State in the country in Steve Simon and some of the best and most secure and most accessible elections in the country because people need to have access to vote. The fact that the fact that Election Day is not a national holiday, the fact that it's not done on a weekend is...
The fact that it's only done one day.
Exactly.
Well, I mean, why can't we do this for a week?
It should
like
be.
a Monday through Friday.
Polling places could be open from Monday to Friday. The fact that not everyone at their job has the protection that says they have mandated time to go vote during the day. If you don't work in a union, you probably don't have that. If you work at
opportunity.
If you work at Walmart or Target, you don't necessarily. They may say that you get to do that, but you may face consequences for doing that. And that's supposed to be illegal, but that never gets prosecuted, never gets checked into. In a fair election, I'd have no problem telling you I am 100% certain that Biden and Harris are going to win, and that it's going to be a massive rebuke of these last 4 years. At this point, I'm not sure.
You're not.
I still think that Biden and Harris are the favorite. The polling suggests that, and if the polling is as accurate as it was in 2018, it says that you can look online right now and see it's like 70-30. Most simulations, most models say 70% chance for Biden, and all of the Biden wins seem to be bigger. But the historical trends of our country don't necessarily agree with that. I mean, you'd have to go back to George H.W. Bush is the last time a sitting president lost his bid for re-election when Bill Clinton won. And that election was different in so many ways because Bill Clinton didn't even get 50% of the popular vote. You had Ross Perot, who got millions of votes.
I was going to say a
large
portion.
percentage. Clinton only ended up with a plurality of the popular vote. It ended up being an electoral landslide because Perot's voter bloc took votes away from Bush more than from Clinton. And then we saw that in 2000 with Ralph Nader taking votes away from Al Gore. Yep. We saw that in 2016 with Jill Stein in particular taking votes away from Hillary Clinton. There's a lot of unpredictability. I'd like to tell you that the debates are going to be key, but I don't know if they will be. I thought they were in 2016. Clinton won all three rather easily, and it didn't matter. I mean, the Harris-Pence debate is going to be a smackdown.
Yeah.
It's going to be brutal. I'm going to love it. But I don't know how much that's going to do for people.
Exactly.
We have a lot of work to do in 67 days. We have to leave it all out there. I mean, you just can't leave anything up to chance at this point. And then there's the reality that he might contest this and that we might not necessarily know for certain, for a few weeks or even a month or two after the election. Now, it would behoove the Republican Party to certify the results before Inauguration Day, because if they don't, constitutionally speaking, without a declared victor, Nancy Pelosi becomes president.
That's true.
And that's really going to piss Donald Trump and the Republicans off because they hate her so much. And they'd rather have Biden be president than her.
Yeah.
But
oh my God, that's funny.
So yeah, I mean, I definitely think that Biden's the favorite.
Yeah.
For whatever that's worth. I don't work for the Biden campaign, but having experienced working for a presidential campaign earlier this year, having experienced working in very contested elections and working on the Walz campaign and statewide election in 2018, I think there's good reason to be hopeful that he's going to win. But I also understand, the fact that he's not necessarily the most inspiring, magnanimous, electrifying candidate. Obama
Like
was
the charisma.
Yeah, he was. I mean, President Obama was lightning in a bottle. He was a generational politician in the way that he was able to speak to people, and the way that he was able to, inspire those who had, thought that politics had left them behind, in particular people of color.
Yeah. Have you read the Michelle Obama book?
I haven't. But when she was at the X, I went to her talk and she talked about it. Yeah. And I was fortunate enough to attend the President Obama's first inauguration in D.C. in 2009.
Really?
And when you talk about, seeing people in tears, particularly people of color in tears, I saw it firsthand. It was
far cry from today.
Oh yeah, I mean, and yeah, I can confirm without a shadow of a doubt that Trump's inauguration crowd was a lot smaller than Obama's, because I was there in person, and I was halfway through the crowd, and the crowd basically went from the inauguration stage to the Washington Monument, and we were packed in to the point where you couldn't sit down, and we had to get there at the inauguration was at 11. It was 11. It was 90 minutes long, and we got there at 5:30 in the morning, and that's where we were. People had been there for hours and hours prior to that. I think they ended up with like the overhead count it was like close to maybe like 2 million people were at this inauguration. It was just an incredible experience. But I'm not going to leave anything up to chance. That's why I do the work I do, and that's why I'm invested in trying to change hearts and minds around whatever issue I can. And it's changed over the years. I don't work for a candidate right now, but I work in politics, and I'm hopeful that despite the fact that a lot of people aren't necessarily going to like Joe Biden, I'm hoping that they can identify with him and understand that humility means something, that when they talk about this being the battle for the soul of America, it's not hyperbolic. If Trump wins re-election, first and foremost, any Republican who says if Trump, in the event that Trump loses, any Republican in 2021 that says, well, that was then, he's not the party's standard bearer. No, you elected him president. The GOP is the party of Trump, period. The fact that they have gone along with the things that he and Jared Kushner and Ivanka and all these other people, Stephen Miller, have put into place, and they have not fought it. I mean, that's what their party is.
Correct.
And we should not let them off the hook if they're trying to say, well, that was crazy. Oh man,
not me.
I hate. It wasn't me though. It's like, no, you spoke. We saw you speak at the RNC, Marco Rubio. We saw you speak at the RNC. We know, where you stand on this. Your endorsement was glowing.
Yeah, but back to what I said earlier. That political suicide by jumping on board with him, I think is very good. Be very detrimental. Yeah. I don't know how to say this best other than, we have this moment in time in our country right now, right, where, like I talked earlier about the polarizing nature, right, as polarizing it gets. Okay, so let's forget about Trump in the group, and let's forget about Biden and Harris in the group.
Yeah.
Okay. We have the ideal candidate to lead the country, right? It's not Biden, it's not Harris, it's not Trump, it's not Pence. But it's somebody, right, that can bring this country together to do what we need to do. Who do you think that person is?
I don't think there's a person right now. I mean, I can't think. I've often thought about that over the last couple of years. Like, who is the best candidate? Who's the best person to lead our country in the times that we're living in? And I wish I had an answer for that. The reality is that Barack Obama came out of nowhere.
I know.
And he was the right person for that time. I don't think that's deniable at this point. He was the right person for those 8 years. And he wasn't without flaws. He did things that I didn't agree with. He, particularly with foreign policy. But you will never find the perfect candidate because you'll never find the perfect person because we are all inherently flawed.
No doubt
I mean?
about it. But I'm just saying, like, who would be a candidate that could somewhat mesh a little bit of the right, mesh a little bit of the left, bring it together to do something special? Like, I just don't know who that is.
I don't know who it is in terms of a national perspective, but I can tell you a lot of that is why Tim Walz won the election in 2018 for governor.
Correct.
When I worked on his campaign for 13 months, he was that for us. And I believe he still is that in this state, where he has humble beginnings, not being a National Guardsman, being a school teacher, coming from a farming family, having humble roots, and then, not only taking that call to action to join the military and serve our country, but then taking the call to action to run for Congress and then run for governor. His story is relatable to a lot of people. He speaks to people like they are at his same level, and I spent a lot of time with him one-on-one in 2017 and 2018, and the person that you see, I can tell you, is the same person you don't see like this.
But behind closed doors.
Exactly. In the office, in the car. He's the same as he is when he's doing the press conferences or when he's meeting with advisors and everything like that. He is the same. That's just who he is.
Have you heard about that young Tubbs kid from Stockton, California?
No. Oh, yeah. I don't know much about it, but yeah.
He seems like the real deal. So
those people are coming though, and the thing is, we won't know. You don't know who they are until they kind of break out and announce themselves.
Arrive.
Exactly. And when you know it, you see it. When Obama spoke in 2006 at the DNC, or at 2004 in the DNC, I mean, Newsweek's next cover story was, is he the next president? Is he the next Democratic hope? You know it when you see it, and when it happens, we will know. But there's a reason it hasn't happened yet. We are at a transitional period in our politics where too many of the people running are just too old. I mean, I don't like the fact that Biden's 77. I don't like the fact that Warren was I think 74. Trump is like 76. Sanders is in his is like 72, 73. And but you did see a lot of enthusiasm at certain points for younger candidates. Pete Buttigieg got people inspired for a little bit.
True.
And
Rubio on the other side.
Exactly,
right?
too. And for a long time in 2016, I thought it was going to be him.
Texas, help me out, El Paso.
Beto O'Rourke.
Beto, yeah.
Yeah, and so those people are there. What we need is the next level of that. Yeah. And I think that's building, and what I think is actually potentially going to come out of the struggles that we're in terms of this pandemic, and the struggles that we're in terms of the fact that race relations in our country are going backwards.
Yeah.
We're going backwards now for decades, and have been massively accelerated in the last few years with this unrest and this unease and the targeting of using policies to target people who are non-white. That's going to create something. It's going to turn someone who maybe isn't even in politics right now into that person we need. And
like John Lewis said, George Floyd, was his Emmett Till.
Yep.
Right. Somebody probably seeing what we're seeing in our country, going, this shit ain't right.
No, I gotta do something.
We gotta do something about it. And so hopefully there's gonna just create a massive grassroots change.
And that's my hope. And and I think my hope is that people can continue to try to find hope in whatever they can, because it is hard. It's coming harder and harder to find it. I understand the cynicism. I understand the negativity. Things are bad right now. We are not in a good place in terms of social issues. I mean, undeniably, we are in a bad place. It's worse than it was a few years ago. I don't care what people on the right say. Then they say that that it started with Obama pinning people. That's just absolutely categorically false. What people don't seem to understand is when you're trying to level the playing field, inherently you have to bring it down like this.
Yeah.
But equity and equality are important things, and
there's a lot of individuals that are going to vote simply with their pocketbook.
Absolutely.
And if you're voting with your pocketbook, no matter how you want to argue that Obama made the changes, Trump's last 4 years, etc., like, your dollar is worth more. Your home is worth more. Right? Like, rates are low. You can just go on and on to say my dollar goes farther than it's been in a long time. So that conversation needs to come at the cost of what? Right?
Yeah.
At the cost of what? Like, if I'm voting simply with only my pocketbook and no other moral compass, the reality is, I might vote Trump. if that's not my mainstay, and that is not my North Star, no pun intended, to what actually fuels me and what fuels the future of my being and who I am and what I want, I need to look at other things than just the dollar.
See, I would push back a little bit though, because the reality is this has been, the stock market's the highest it's ever been, right? But wages are low, wages are stagnant. The stock market's as high as it's been, but unemployment's still over 10% right now. You look at, you had, I think, Laura Trump, I can't remember which one it was, talking about how Trump had created 4 million jobs for women as of March. But at that point, because of the pandemic now, the net loss is over 3 million jobs for women. So that's a 7 million job dip. We had another 10 million Americans file for unemployment assistance in the last week, according to the numbers that just came out. So I don't know if your dollar is actually going for it. It may be going further for you in the very short term, but as far as building wealth and saving and growing your net worth, unless you are at the top, the tippy top of the economic charts, I don't actually think that's actually accurate. And the one thing the right does really well is what they do is they sell people on this promise that if you work hard, you will become rich. It's just not that simple. This idea that you pull yourself up by your own bootstraps, that's not how this works, because if you're trying to do that, the systems put in place are just stepping on you further and further and more and more. And what we need to see is when we talk about things like raising the minimum wage, we get vilified for saying, well, I hear people say all the time, like, well, why should a fry cook make $20 an hour when I'm working at a hardware store and I'm making 12? It's like, no, I'm saying that you should make more too. And I'm saying that yes, that person should make $20 an hour working at Burger King, because anyone who works full time should be able to put a roof over their head and feed their kids, and ideally as well have a little money on the side to go see a movie or to go on a vacation. Like, these things should not be exclusive to the richest of the rich. These are things that everyone should be able to do and enjoy. We only get one life. We need to be able to enjoy it. We need to be able to know that we are progressing. And for far too long, life has been just about survival for so many people. And surviving is not living. There are two very different things. So
I'm with you. So to finish here, I know you had the hypothetical of United States Postal Service and on and on. But just give me who wins, what this is going to look like 2021. All right. Real quick.
Okay, so I do think we'll hold on to Minnesota here for Biden. I think actually, it was way too. Clinton only won the state by 1.5 points. I do think that there will be more enthusiasm for Biden than there was for Clinton. He has less baggage. And that's not necessarily fair for me to say, because I do think Hillary Clinton was incredibly qualified, and I voted for her enthusiastically. And she was my preferred candidate in 2016. I voted. I didn't go to the caucus because I was not in town at the time. But if I had gone, I would have caucused for her, even though Sanders won the Minnesota caucuses handily. And that's not to say I wouldn't have voted for Bernie if he won the nomination. It didn't matter to me. I do think we'll win Minnesota. I think the most likely scenario that I see is that Joe Biden becomes the first Democrat to win the presidency without winning Ohio. The saying used to be, as goes Ohio, goes the nation. I think we're going to see that change. I think Trump's got Ohio pretty much locked in, and same with Iowa. But I do think Biden's campaign is doing well in Michigan, in Pennsylvania, in North Carolina, and potentially even in Arizona.
What about Wisconsin?
That's going to be a tight one too. That's really a coin flip, I think, at this point. And the polling shows that Trump is slightly ahead. Unfortunately, I think what's happening in Kenosha is still just polarizing people. I know people are fed up with the fact that that didn't come up once during the RNC last night. I don't think Trump will mention it tonight, except to say that we're sending in the National Guard to keep law and order on
peaceful protesting, bullshit.
It's all that. Yeah. I don't know if Biden will win Wisconsin. I think it's going to be one of the closest states. But I think he'll carry Illinois. I think he'll carry North Carolina. I think Trump will win Florida. I think Texas is actually kind of up for grabs, which is nuts to say.
Nuts.
And I think Biden has a good chance of winning Arizona. And if he, in early on election night on Tuesday, November 3rd, when the polls close in the Midwest and they start closing in the East Coast or in the West Coast, and they've already closed in the East. The states to look at will be North Carolina, there'll be Michigan and Pennsylvania, and then as we move further west, will be a state to look at, and then you'll have to look at Arizona and Nevada, and if Biden wins the majority of those states, he's going to win the election.
Mm-hmm.
Like I said, I've been comfortable with this ticket for a long time. I have always really respected Joe Biden. I think his humility and the fact that he is a very down-to-earth person is going to play well. The attacks on him right now are that he's mentally unfit. It's the pot calling the kettle black, I think. I mean,
Agreed.
Trump can't even read a teleprompter.
Not
and
at all.
Biden gets criticized for using one.
Yep.
And, his speech at the DNC, I didn't watch a lot of the DNC. I watched the DNC and the RNC obsessively in 2016, and I realized that probably wasn't a good thing. Mm-hmm. It gave me a very, very big false sense of security. So I've actually avoided both of these things, and I've just watched kind of the highlights on social media or the little clips that come the day after. Biden's speech was tremendous.
I agree.
And
I agree.
even people on the right on Fox News, like Chris Wallace and even like Bill O'Reilly on his own little network thing that he has now, were saying that was really good. Mm-hmm. They're going to have to come up with new attacks. They're going to try to relitigate 2016. They're going to try to tie Biden to Clinton. Mm-hmm. I don't know if that's going to work as well as they want it to. I hope it doesn't, because they're very different people, and they really didn't work together very long in terms of working in the Senate or when Clinton was Secretary of State for a few years. They worked together a little bit, but their jobs didn't necessarily align to the point where they were in some back corner scheming up things, as the right would have you believe. But I do think we're going to win. I have to think we're going to win. Mm-hmm. You have to keep that positivity and that hopefulness, even though things are dire. I think one of the biggest and strongest indicators is that the primary turnouts were huge. In particular, people voting by mail and voting early were just massive across the country. And here in Minnesota, we smashed records for voting by mail. And I've talked to a few thousand people, or reached out to a few thousand people in the last week or so to talk about voting by mail, and talked to maybe close to 500 people. And I think over 400 of them either said that they already had applied for their mail ballot, or that they were going to send the application in and they couldn't wait to vote. So the enthusiasm may not be for Biden, but it is there to remove Trump from office. Yep. And that is the one thing that works in our advantage, because incumbency advantage is a real thing. Trump's raised more money than Biden. That comes more easily when you're the incumbent. Biden's at a disadvantage because of the pandemic and not being able to go do local town halls and go meet with people and shake hands. And that's something he's really good at.
No doubt.
Is when you get to meet him one-on-one or in small groups and shake his hand, he looks you in the eye and he talks to you like you're an important person. That means a lot. Trump was never good at that. He would hold his rally, he'd say the same speech, and then he'd go on to the next thing. That's what he's good at. He's good at these little quick hits.
Yep, grandiose jargon.
And he gives his
it is what it is.
He talks about the fake news and he repeats himself over and over again, and his base eats it up. Mm-hmm. But just like any other election in modern history, 45% on each side have already been locked in, and it comes down to that last 10%. And I do think for the most part, people are really fed up with the disintegration of our reputation abroad. I think people are fed up with the lying. I think people are fed up with, the tweeting. I think people are fed up with the name calling. And I'll take whatever I can get. If I can get you to vote, for Joe Biden this fall, it doesn't really matter to me. But it's going to take a lot of convincing, not necessarily for people in the middle, for us, but for people on the far left who are supporters of Bernie Sanders and supporters of things like the Green New Deal. Mm-hmm. But you're going to see that reflected in, and you've seen it reflected in the Democratic platform. A lot of these progressive policies that people are staking their reputations on, Biden's listening to and he's putting them in. And that's important. And you're never going to win everyone over. But my hope is that people understand the dangers of abstaining from this election. Mm-hmm. It ended up being 20% of Americans decided the election last year, and 15% actually voted when you look at the breakdown of eligible voters. If you had, Clinton won the popular vote, but the actual winner of the popular vote was I didn't vote. And that's a huge problem.
Yeah.
So making sure that the election's accessible and making sure that everyone gets a chance to vote early or vote on election day or vote by mail, however they see fit, but making sure that they can do it, and making sure they understand that their vote does count and it matters. And if we can put those things in place, and I think we are doing that incrementally, despite the pandemic, despite the fact that I haven't been going out and knocking on everyone's door lately, we're still going to do that.
Yeah.
We're still going to try, and we're going to give it everything we got. And
well, we'll see if
my
you're
hope
right.
is that we can make it happen. So
We'll
I still am optimistic, even though things. I understand why people aren't.
Yeah.
I understand that Biden isn't most people's preferred candidate, but he does check a lot of the boxes for what you would consider presidential, and we don't have any of that right now.
I couldn't agree with you more. So I just want to say thanks for coming.
Of course, thanks for having me.
Number two is, your passion behind what you do and how you do it, and the representing the party, et cetera. It's just infectious, and so love that in anybody. So
I appreciate that.
So thanks for coming in and spending time just sharing your thoughts.
If you ever want to have me back, I'm available. So
Awesome.
maybe
Thanks, Jared.
We can talk again after this is done.
All right, sounds
we can
good.
see what we're gonna